the transition to net zero is very much a similar sort of story, and companies really are going to have to reimagine their whole business model. As an example, and I'm not saying this is a great, one's better than the other, but you buy a shoe at the moment, like a Nike sneaker, and you wear it for 6 months and you throw it in the bin. In future, that's not going to work. And I've seen other companies try like a subscription model. You use it up, you return it to the company, you get a new one. So that's an example of a business model sort of being completely overturned.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, where we interview climate tech founders and VCs to discuss all things building and investing to solve the biggest challenge of our generation, climate change. This is episode 86 of the show. I'm your host, Silas Maynor, and thank you for joining us on today's episode. If you are a returning listener, we thank you for your support. And as you might know, we put a lot of work into making this show happen, so we are asking that you take 1 minute to help us today. And we'd like you to send this episode to 2 people you know, so something very specific. One person that you think would like this content and who agrees with you on these things, and one person you think might disagree with this content. Somebody maybe is a climate change denier, or somebody who's just kind of skeptical of the whole thing. This will really help us to spread the word of the show in different angles and help maximize the effort we are putting in. So we really, really appreciate your help on making this happen. Please also leave us a review if you are a returning listener, as you're returning, so hopefully you enjoy the show. Before we get into the episode details, a quick note for any founders listening as well. If you are a founder in the space seeking funding or looking for partnerships, please reach out and we'll gladly make any introductions that we can. And a quick thank you to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you personally are looking to make a career change, reach out to next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. All right, so let's get into the episode details. Today we spoke with Joe Bushnell, and I had met Joe before he launched Azollo, so it's a pretty cool guest to have on since I got to hear where he was at prior to the launch of this company. He's from Australia. He developed a certain attachment to the issue of climate change at a young age when wildfires destroyed his town and burned his school growing up. It's a pretty kind of traumatic incident that really made an impact on him. And he went on to study sustainability in uni. He then went into consulting and finance, kind of winding his way back to sustainable finance. And eventually, desiring to pursue a deeper connection directly to the space, he started his own company. So in today's conversation, we talk about this journey and how he ended up founding Azollo to help corporates transition and upskill their workforces. This is vital for corporates to achieve the sustainability targets they have set. It's a really interesting challenge in general. And we also talked about his advice to other aspiring founders thinking of jumping ship. And then we ended on the topic of mentoring and how much tech will be able to revolutionize the talent space. We also discussed where he thinks where we think the boundaries of tech are. So really fun episode. One other thing just to kind of go back onto is that upskilling the sustainability talent inside of corporates is, I think, something a lot of people overlook is you can't just have a team of 5 or 6 individuals, even maybe 20, in a corporate that can make this company sustainable. It has to be something that's kind of ingrained into the culture, which is why it's so important for kind of a high-level upskilling of the entire workforce, not just a few specialists in the space. So again, really fun episode with Joe. And without any further delay, let's get into the show. All right, welcome to the show, Joe. How's it going?
Yeah, good, thanks. Great to be here. Keen to talk about climate tech.
Yeah, same here. It's a bit of an interesting situation. So usually I meet people sometimes after the show in person, but I've already met you in person when you were visiting New York. So it's going to be interesting and nicer to already know the person I'm speaking with to some extent, right? So I want to do this a little bit differently than I usually do. So instead of going into your backstory first, let's start with what you're doing right now and just get right into the weeds of what you're doing with Azollo.
Yeah, definitely. It's a slightly different concept to a lot of climate tech ideas that I've talked to people about. So it's probably good to get into the detail. So at Azollo, we're really looking to put the workforce at the center of climate transition. So we are a climate tech company that is building a platform, a workforce intelligence platform, to give companies visibility into how their workforce, kind of the skill needs, the gaps they might have in what their workforce can do to implement climate strategy, and really provide the sort of decision tools and analytics that companies seem to be lacking, so that they can make proper decisions and their workforce can actually execute in their day-to-day roles, not just sort of understand climate at a conceptual level, but really understand, if they're an accountant, what that does to their day-to-day, whether that's carbon accounting into their role, or, you know, if they're a product designer, how they need to change their processes and maybe understand sustainability to reframe how they design products in future.
Mm-hmm. So maybe to try to just kind of summarize to see if I got this correct. So a corporate sets a sustainability target. They may not actually have the talent in-house to handle that. But even in addition to maybe hiring a team of, let's say, 3 or 4 ESG folks or sustainability folks, that actually, in order to really make the impact, has to be kind of implemented across the entire team, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I think if you go back to first principles, climate transition, sustainability and net zero, they're really complex, and it's not enough anymore to just have an ESG team or a couple of specialists that sort of float around the organization and maybe help to set plans and write reports and set strategy, that sort of thing. It's really about, and if we're going to be successful, if companies are going to be successful in transforming themselves to be low carbon emitters in future, it really needs to permeate through to every role and every person within an organization. And that's where there's just a massive blocker at the moment. People don't know what to do. They don't know where to start. There's all these terms being thrown around. And companies have set all these goals, these commitments to net zero, but they haven't actually looked at how does that turn into execution. Mm-hmm. And we need to get past that, you know, to that real execution step.
Mm-hmm. So who would you say are the kind of key customers then? Like what size of company works best to do this with?
Yeah, realistically, large corporates, your multinationals, those sort of companies that have quite complex operations, have a lot of different teams. It's really around synthesizing a lot of different information from around an organization and bringing different teams and different skill sets together to build that sort of interdisciplinarity that is essential to a sustainable business model.
Mm-hmm. And then, so maybe I'd be keen, I'm assuming, I don't know if you have the data on this yet or not, but there might be kind of a certain ROI for investing into their people this way. Can you talk about maybe the financial side of things? You know, they're going to spend money to implement this process, this training. What's the benefit to them as well, aside from achieving their targets?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think on the financial side, we're seeing a lot of movement. So companies we're speaking with a year ago might not have had any budget for training their workforce in this space. They might have a general L&D budget, but we're seeing companies now set a learning budget for their workforce for climate and sustainability. And then we're seeing also a lot of discussion around what sort of funding they need to buy new tools, invest in new software, and that sort of thing to really aid their transition. I think that's being really pushed by regulation, to be honest, regulation and reporting requirements. It is a risk management exercise at the moment. But for instance, you have in the UK, the Treasury came out with a climate transition plan document that had a whole chapter on workforce, and essentially that will become a legislated need for companies to report on how they're, taking their climate strategy and upskilling their workforce to implement it. So I think there's a lot of financial pressure from investors and government and the sort of movement we're seeing broadly to accelerate decarbonisation. Companies, it's really a cultural piece. Some companies, it's business units who are looking to invest in this. And for them, it's about addressing needs from sort of customers who are asking difficult questions or suppliers who are asking difficult questions. I would say quantifying the ROI at the moment, isn't necessary. It's more of a, we need to do something and we're going to try things, rather than we need to hit a certain return on this investment in training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would assume though that there's definitely kind of negative consequences to not achieving their targets, right? Because they only have,
Yeah.
so many years before people start saying, well, you said these targets, but it sounds like greenwashing to me, right? So I feel like
Yeah.
there's a certain brand, price if they, especially if it's a direct to consumer brand, that they need
Yeah.
to maintain. I would also assume perhaps something along the talent attraction. If there's maybe it's a smaller group within a big company, but if the company is actually investing into upskilling these people, wouldn't that also help with talent attraction?
Absolutely. And that's something I left off my answer just before. Something that has really struck me is the difficulty companies are having with retaining talent and hiring new talent around this question of climate and sustainability. And that's a generational shift, I think. I'm sure you're seeing it, but people want to work for companies that are transparent and clear and pushing ahead with being climate conscious, not companies that are laggards. And it's also just becoming really difficult to get good talent who have some idea around sustainability. It also, companies are really trying to build their own teams. And so even with consultancies, it's hard to bring consultancies in to do your work unless you're, a blue chip firm who has a long-standing relationship and can pay the fees. So definitely companies are facing this crunch of needing to bring in new talent and motivate talent to stay. And part of it is providing clarity on what that means for their career, for their skills, and opportunities to upskill and expand their potential in this space so that they feel that their work aligns with their values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen. I don't know. It seems like it's just this week, or at least recently, I've seen a lot more of this news around climate quitting. A new term. There's quiet quitting, and there's climate quitting, and I think that it is very real. Like if I think about people in my generation, they're not interested in working in certain industries because of the kind of consequences to the environment through those things, right? So I guess I do want to go back because obviously, we've spoken off camera before, but I want to talk about why did you decide to start the company? Did you see a specific need? Were you kind of looking to do something in climate on your own and you just kind of found something that was a need, or was this something that was pretty clear to you and then you just set out to solve the problem?
Yeah. I mean, hindsight's a powerful thing. In hindsight, it's very clear, but I didn't know it at the time. I've spent the last few years, I was at PwC consulting on climate strategy, helping companies buy green assets. So whether that's recycling plants or buy and build solar and wind, renewable energy farms. I was working with all these companies and really seeing a need for an acceleration in innovation. I think a lot of these large businesses are quite slow. And I got a bit frustrated with that. And I wanted to step out and really work at the cutting edge. And I thought it was a good time, basically, to get involved. And I really have always been quite purpose-driven. And I wanted to add more purpose to what I was doing. So I quit. I jumped off the cliff, I suppose, without a clear idea and without quite knowing what would happen. I went through quite a bit of a process, actually, of thinking through ideas, meeting people, discussing them. I thought, surely, such a big space, there's heaps of ideas. I'll come up with something. I've got all this experience. And that proved quite hard and quite daunting. And I went through a bunch of ideas until I sort of realized, I think there's a fallacy. And if we're talking around, founders here, I think there's a fallacy that you just have this light bulb moment and come up with this idea and it's brilliant. And then you go build a company and, sell it for millions of dollars. It's not quite how it works in my experience. And the more I read up on other entrepreneurs and the like, I think it's much more of a process. And what happened was I ended up going back to first principles and I just went out to everyone in my network and started asking them exactly what sort of problems they had. And after about 30 interviews, I realized everyone had said the exact same thing. And it was that their workforce capability was their biggest blocker to transitioning. And that really got me thinking around my own experience, which was a real difficulty with hiring people, with finding people with the right skills and motivations. And, the real struggles advising companies, communicating and engaging and really getting the scale and complexity of this problem to be well understood. So, it became quite a powerful idea after a bit of research. That seems really simple in hindsight, but yeah, it took me a bit of time to get to.
Yeah, I mean, I think hindsight is 2020, obviously, but I do think that it seems very interesting. Obviously hindsight does seem very simple, but every entrepreneur I've ever spoken with on here, it seems as though there either was one or the other. They had like a very, very clear idea of what to do, or they had to go through this kind of like process of really, really trying, and it was very difficult. So I guess what would your advice be if you were to go back? Maybe you're talking to somebody right now who's thinking about jumping off the cliff. What is your advice to them before they jump off, or once they jump off? Like what is your advice to them in this space?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I was kind of fortunate enough to be able to jump off and take the time and free up that time and energy to really think through what I was doing. We obviously can't do that, all do that. So definitely, if you're in a job and you're thinking about this, go out and talk to everyone you know. Not people who are your friends necessarily, but people you work with, people in the broader industry, and start to suss out their problems. I think that's really, just collect a lot of market data on what issues people are having, and then you can sort of condense that down and really think about it deeply. I think one mistake that I've seen a few people make is they think about things in their daily life. So it's maybe offsetting their personal carbon footprint, or it's recycling in the bin at home. Those sort of things aren't necessarily scalable solutions, and a lot of them have been tried. And so I think it's really finding a niche that you're interested in, but also that you get a lot of common feedback that there's a problem there, and then you can look to solve that problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting. There's a lot of from listening to My First Million, I've heard a lot of these entrepreneurs come on who are like, oh, this is a dumb idea, but it would solve one thing that I would want to choose, right, to change, right? But it's not necessarily commercially viable. I think it is interesting, especially in the context of climate, because it can be pretty easy when you have this deep motivation to kind of help fix climate change. You see one thing, you jump on it without maybe doing research to realize, oh, actually, you know what? There's like 16 other companies doing this or that tried this, and perhaps it's maybe not the greatest place to go now. Again, maybe it is, maybe the timing's better, but definitely worth considering. I feel like this is a good spot to maybe go even further back to the beginnings of like, what was your motivation, German? Like, how did you become interested in climate at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really long journey, to be honest. I think my first exposure to a changing climate and what sort of impact that can have was probably when I was about 13. And our capital in Australia, Canberra, was hit by some pretty horrendous bushfires. I think it was the first instance of a fire tornado being recorded. And you just think of that concept, like that's scary, right? And that's what it was like. It came a few hundred meters from my house, burnt down part of my school. And I can still sort of remember the sound, like jet engines coming over the hill as the fires sort of bore down. So back then, I think, I really had a really close encounter with nature and the impacts that we can face from it. And then over the years, I did a lot of emergency work. I worked with our volunteer emergency services. I, did some earthquake reconstruction, sort of volunteering overseas in South America. And I always had this sense of like giving back and purpose and community and all around the environment. And yeah, then, I studied my undergraduate degree in environment studies and sustainable design. But then it kind of stopped because at that time, there wasn't really much recognition of it. You know, there was talk around climate, but Australia's had a really difficult transition to accepting that climate change is a big issue we need to address. And there weren't really many jobs or anything like that. And that really put me on a journey of, well, if this is an issue that we need to address, how do we do it commercially and reform the current way we do things? Because that seemed to be the big blocker, which led me into banking. And fortunately, I kind of circled my way back to things like renewable energy financing and social housing development and that sort of thing. But yeah, it was a long journey around. And I think I'm fortunate now because I've experienced all sort of facets of the industry. You know, I've worked in big corporates, I've advised, I've consulted to companies, I've dealt with renewable energy, I've dealt with social, like the people side of, I guess, sustainability. But it took a while, I think, for me to come around to the idea that I needed to really put the foot down and come up with something and really push the boundaries of how we transition.
Mm-hmm. Did you feel, I mean, throughout that journey of changing probably different opportunities inside of the companies you were at, did you constantly feel kind of like a little bit unsettled where you were trying to like, hey, I need to find something, you mastered a new skill and that was exciting, but then you wanted to move on to something else? Was there any of that kind of like, I don't know, just kind of lack of feeling at peace or whatever about the work you were doing at some point? And that is that what kind of led you eventually to kind of come back to what you really want to do?
Yeah, definitely. I think I speak to a lot of entrepreneurs, and I think we all have the same sort of questioning nature. And I think for me, that definitely unsettled me. I'd always see how we were doing things in the bank that I worked at, the companies that I was speaking to were doing things, and it would be, kind of be like, why? You're looking to change this process, but you're not really looking to do it that differently, or you're looking for an answer just to put the band-aid on, have a simple answer, not kind of going back to first principles and really thinking about what we value here, why are we doing this, who does this impact? And I mean, it's the same as if you look at Jeff Bezos, for instance, every video is him talking about customers and his customer obsession, how Amazon is customer first and they'll win by being the best at serving the customer. And I think climate is essentially the same. A lot of organizations I was in were missing both the customer piece and this sense of who are we actually serving here, from a sort of benefit to society point of view. So that's a really powerful driver for me, I think, is really think about how do we help people, how do we make people better, which goes to sort of the workforce side of this as well. At some point, I guess it catches up with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always find it quite interesting because I think that, I'm slightly obsessed with, hearing how entrepreneurs' journeys and stuff go. And it's interesting to hear that again. It seems like they know it right away, or maybe it's just also because we're usually listening to these stories in retrospect, which is, it seems more clear to them now. So they talk about it maybe as a succinct kind of journey, but the reality is that, they had their own insecurities along the way about like, am I in the right place, etc. So I think it's really interesting to open up that can a little bit. Let's go back to what you're doing with Azollo. So I want to talk a little bit about, we talked slightly about the generation shifting, but could you talk about maybe some of the industries that are really, from your data points, that are really going to struggle with talent attraction and why that is? And if there's any in particular that are kind of ahead of trying to head that off at the pass and do things to fix that, knowing they're going to have a struggle to find talent.
Yeah, I think in Australia, our biggest industry is mining. And mining is critical for the energy transition, especially. We mine a lot of critical minerals, things that go into, all these sort of green energy systems, your batteries, your kind of electric vehicles, all of that. But the industry has been really outspoken over the last year or so about their inability to attract younger workers who see it as a dirty industry. And that, I didn't quite see that coming, the vocalization of this. But it's a huge industry that employs, tens of thousands of people. Those heavy emitters, and we have a lot of them here in Australia, I think really have an image problem. Partly because they've dragged their feet, and it's the same with oil and gas, and I think banking to an extent as well. They've been very much happy to ride the wave of resources and industries that we now seen as being heavy emitters. So they're, I think, really having to think deeply around what does that mean for their workforce, and how do we communicate that we're actually at the forefront, because a lot of them are heavily investing in their transition, and heavily investing in how their whole operations transform, how they, if you're a mine, how do you replace your diesel vehicles with hydrogen or electric vehicles? They're kind of at the cutting edge, but people don't see that. People just see that they're dirty. So those organizations are having to really think deeply around what their workforce looks like. But for me, a lot of it is actually a bit closer to home. One industry we talk to a lot is sort of commercial real estate, and that makes up around 40% of emissions, if you include their electricity use. They face a lot of pressures because they face city, state, federal regulation. That's, I think, pretty similar all around the world. And they're also traditionally, they have a lot of people who've been in the industry for a long time. There's set ways of doing things, and so they're facing a bit of a reality check when it comes to how they change the way they do things. And they've started off really strongly on the measuring emissions and water use and that sort of thing. But now it's getting to the pointy end where people need to know, if they replace a ventilation system in a building, why they have to choose a different one, and why it matters for the business overall. And I think real estate is one industry, especially that only has, or that has quite small, like the information flow across different parts of the business and types of business doesn't necessarily make it clear how those things relate. And I think that's where we're focused, is industries and companies where there's a big gap between communication, information flow, and how different parts move together. Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah, so maybe we can use that and kind of keep going on that example. So within real estate, what are some of the ways that tech can help enable this, both from their own workforce kind of transition aspect, but also just in ways to enable their business to be more profitable? I know enough about the clean real estate space that it is a better return on investment. At least currently it is. It'll be eventually a discount, but what are some of those things that they can do to really up their game, and then to assure that they can attract talent and upskill their existing talent?
Yeah, I mean, the core of real estate for the last few years has been just measuring your use of electricity, water, where your waste goes. And so there's a lot of data being collected, but not a lot of optimization. And the other problem is that you've got a large kind of capital stock, in that all these buildings with a lot of material, they last a long time. There's a lot of carbon embodied in those materials. So when you're sort of upgrading, and we're seeing that a lot here, offices that go from, everyone wants a Class A office, or Grade A office. There's a lot of renovation going on. How does that work? How do we do that in a low carbon manner? So I think technology is really important, both from, one great example is digital twins for buildings. And most people don't see all the complexity that goes into a building, the air conditioning systems, the electric systems, the refits, the way light, I worked in this office where they put tinting on the windows so that it was more energy efficient. And so we had to bring in lamps because it was too dark inside, which kind of blows the whole thing up. So I think technology is really important because it lets you put a large scale solution in place. It lets you bring together disparate bits of information and see things on a systems level. And I think sustainability in business is really about that systems level thinking. It's being able to understand where an input comes from, how it flows through, what that means at the other end. And, most people can't do that. Most kind of think through all that information and track it in real time, whereas technology is kind of fundamental to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do you see? I mean, if you're talking to these companies to try to work with them, what is typically the big objection if they do want to make these transition? Is there a specific objection you come up against a lot, and how do you kind of work through that?
I think it's just recognizing the scale of the change. It's a learning journey. Organizations, I mentioned before, are approaching this from a risk management perspective rather than an opportunity perspective. So it's things like, do we have gaps in our data collection? Are our emissions tracking down? What's the bare minimum we can do? And I think where we're starting to see a shift is going, okay, how do we become the most sustainable company in our industry? How do we rethink the way we do things to actually make this, operationalize efficiency so that we get cost savings or benefits as well as just being seen to be more sustainable? So I really think that's the kind of the change that's happening. And the pushback we get is we're doing what's required, or we've put in our data systems, we're reporting on our sustainability, that's all we need to do. Or, how does this even relate to my job or my industry? And again, that's an education piece, and we're seeing that change quite rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, I can assume it's very difficult because you need to have essentially some level of understanding. I saw this within recruitment of a lot of companies. Trying to they came to me, they say, hey, we want a sustainability manager, and then they build a job description, which is obviously a job for 3 people instead of 1, and they don't know this, right? And then they start getting into it, they see the candidates and they tell me, oh man, we just change our mind, we're gonna do something else. And it's like, obviously they didn't know enough to even get into it, so it's difficult. You've got the situation where it's like a chicken and egg situation.
It's a great thing you mentioned about skills and job ads. And I think that's something else we haven't really talked about, but I'm sure you see it a lot, is that there's no real settled definition on what the skills are, both in what to call them, but also what we need. And that's a real blocker. And I think one really easy starting point for companies would be to sit down and think through their kind of skills, structure, taxonomy, what they need to bring in, and define those terms. And that kind of applies to any skills in an organization, but these green skills are really important to get your head around, and most people don't at the moment. It seems to be a real emphasis on kind of soft skills like stakeholder management and communication rather than anything a bit more substantial.
Yeah, no. I mean, it makes sense. I think that it's something I've noticed is when the company knows what they're doing, they'll ask for something very specific, right? A very, very specific type of ESG or sustainability experience. But this brings up the question, what are, if the company as a whole needs to raise the general awareness, you start working with the company, what are the first things that you can really do with them, or that they kind of implement to help educate the broader workforce, not just the people in sustainability, but the broader workforce on these terms? Like, what are those key elements?
Well, we're doing 2 things at the moment. The first is a Sustainability Foundations e-learning course, but it's a bit different to most of the courses that you see around the place. It's not focused on climate science. or understanding ESG frameworks or policies or anything like that. It's really back to basics. This is how to think about sustainability and be confident thinking about it, conversing with people about it. Here's some frameworks to use to, reframe your thinkings about what it means. And then some more practical tools around, if you're in a customer role or, product role or, an operations role, here's some key things, standard things to look for that you can implement. And here's some practice, exercises and things for you to be comfortable sort of putting up sustainability ideas in your business or adjusting, your sales pitch or things like that. So it's really around making people feel confident about sustainability rather than giving them a ton of factual kind of science and knowledge to carry around the head, because we just know that doesn't work. The second part that we're doing is really around diagnostics, and this is for the organization more specifically. So it's surveys that give insight into how engaged the workforce is with a company's what we call a climate value proposition, whether they feel engaged with it, whether they understand it, whether they know about it, and then how does that make them feel in their role, whether it's motivated or is it pushing them to leave. So there's that sort of thing. And then from the organization side as well, how well are they, perceived and communicating their climate goals and what they're doing in an organization. Because a lot of companies are doing a lot. They've set all these plans. They haven't really communicated it at all. So again, it's around insights into the confidence of people and the clarity that they have. And I think that's really the starting point for organizations and for the workforce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I wasn't thinking about my next question here because I was trying to contemplate what you were talking about. Well, one thing I do have on my list here we could go into is what obviously right now AI is all the rage. It's everybody's talking about it. But I wanted to maybe ask, like, what do you see as the role of AI being in to help people make this transition with their workforce? Do you have any specific data points on this?
Not so much specific data points, but I think there's two components to AI that are really powerful. And if we're talking climate tech in general, it's really useful to think of these. And this is what we're doing with the workforce as well. So two issues with climate are that you need to synthesize a whole lot of complex information together. Often that's ideas from, say, economics, behavioral science, environmental design, climate science. All these need to be mixed together. Very hard for most people to do. We're all specialists in one thing or the other. And there's a lot of research and data out there. So AI is really powerful at synthesizing that information together. The other thing is that the power of AI is really in speeding up our ability to iterate and learn. And we're talking about a transition that needs to happen at an accelerating pace. And we need to really learn and iterate new ways of doing things as quickly as possible. So AI, in that sense, at a high level, is really, really valuable. And I can see a use case for a whole lot of tools across pretty much all parts of business related to decarbonisation, especially. But then if you think about the workforce, it's also, we tend to hire backward looking. And, we do a lot of things like banking is essentially backward looking as well. We look at your past behavior to see if you're going to repay something in future. Same when we hire someone, we look at your past experience and try and predict how you're going to perform in future. Really fraught model, because we then end up hiring people who have already done the job so they can do the job on day one, but then they're likely to leave in 6 months. So what AI can do and what we're looking to do is really make it so you can hire for potential, so that you can give people clarity into sort of the next few years of their career or potential options, and learn and iterate on how that makes people feel, whether that is making them skilled, whether that makes them motivated to stay. And on the flip side, then that gives a company the ability to see where it has gaps, where it's not working, where this training they've put in place is failing to give people the abilities they need in their job, and therefore to really kind of speed up the learning curve around transforming their workforce.
It's quite interesting, actually. I never thought about that. I mean, obviously that's the whole point of doing an interview, is to base off of, hey, can you do what I need you to do? I do find that interesting though, because a lot of people, they only will hire people who can for sure, like they've done the work already. And if you think about it, and anytime there's an emerging space, there's a very small number of people who actually have done that work. I remember when utility scale battery storage was a big thing. It was popping off. Everybody's like, oh yeah, we need to find these engineers who've been doing this, development engineering for 3 years. And I was like, I don't know what you're saying. This literally just started this year. So like there's only gonna be 10 people out there for the very, very early movers, right? For the people who did the pilot project.
I've got a great story on that. I've got a story on that. So there was a job ad for someone with TCFD experience, and it wanted 7 years of experience. TCFD had only existed for like 5 years.
Yeah.
So, it just wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, you see all of these TikToks and these memes around, people graduating uni and then going, and then all these junior roles require, 5 years experience, and it is a bit of a joke, but at the same time, it's like this is actually happening, right? And there's a very unrealistic expectation. I think I was discussing this with some of my friends around the role of the existing workforce to mentor the next workforce, and I think that I don't know if this is a product of remote work or not, but I think that there's a lazy existing workforce who doesn't want to put in the effort to train a new workforce, right? This mentorship, this apprenticeship idea has gone because it's so transactionalized. And I think part of the reason why Gen Z tends to move jobs and younger people tend to move jobs so often is because there is none of that, right? Everybody I've ever bumped into, if they like their manager, the manager is really, developing them, they have no reason to leave. And I think that it's difficult when you have remote work to mentor people more, because it's a lot more work as a manager to train somebody virtually, right? So I think that this could be a whole nother discussion. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this as well, or any observations.
No, I've certainly experienced that. The lack of mentorship, or the people move on so quickly now that you don't have those long-standing relationships, and you don't know if you can learn from people, which is why I think, going back to your question around technology, we need to find other ways to facilitate this. And if it's building tools that better predicts or keep up with what you need to be happy in your job and motivated, or how to connect you with other people in the organization to make you feel more in sync, and if that's mentoring or if that's just connections through other means, I think there's a real capacity there to scale up how the workforce connects, because I don't think we're going back to a sort of apprenticeship model. Things move too fast, like in life in general.
I don't necessarily think we'll move back to an apprenticeship model, but I do wonder about the capacity of AI to help aid this kind of the unspoken side of things, which is like never trained. Like obviously people give boomers a lot of shit for just being like kind of ruining the world in some ways, so just being focused on corporate life and everything. But at the same time, there was a certain type of respect or mentality that came from the older generation teaching the youngers and kind of helping people get skilled at something. I'm currently reading a book called Mastery, and I think it's interesting to talk about this kind of this journey and things. But I do really hope that perhaps someday we can use technology to help humans understand themselves and the other people that they're training, so that they know, oh, actually, I have a role here as a human that AI can't do. Maybe it helped identify, but I need to help mentor that person, right? And that can be the difference between somebody staying a long time in the company. And again, if you have people leaving every 2 years versus getting somebody who's motivated to build something with you for 4 years, 5 years, That's or even people who stick around for 10, 20, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of exponential returns to the company because that person, especially in sales, for example, right? Like, do you have those relationships and things of that nature? So there is a lot of interesting things I think we need to face. I would consider myself a technologist. I love technology in general, but I do think that it's a crutch to some extent, and humans are losing the value of what they are. Like, the value of being human is that we can understand things technology can't. And I sometimes think that we're just kind of slowly getting lazier and lazier. So I think we need to enhance them both, right? Um,
Yeah, definitely. I think one is a tool that, it's that the fact that it's easy to forget about people who work for you, might not be top of mind. It's a sad fact. Like, as much as you care about the people who work for you or around you, often there are more pressing matters like getting that report right, or, something for your boss. And if we can bring back sort of a bit more of a nudge around, oh, you should check in with your mentee, or, have you had your, I don't know, one-to-one catch up this month?
yeah.
Just little reminders that make it easy to have that connection.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bumping into people in the building and the office is an underrated benefit to people's development if the people are good, of course. But I know I had this experience, especially when we hired some more people in my team in the office in New York, and then I had a couple people remotely. And there'd be times where I'd be halfway through the week and I'd be like, man, I didn't really check in on him, holy crap, like I'm such a bad boss, but it's so hard because everything's on fire, right? So yeah, no,
Yeah.
definitely understand that. Before we run out of time, I do want to talk a little bit about more of the experience around raising for this company. So going through the
Yeah.
fundraising process. I'm not sure if you've raised a lot of money or not, but this is a very different type of model. So to me, I don't, maybe you can help me summarize. What would you say are the kind of key components here of this model of business?
We talk about it in two parts. One is what you've identified as that much more sort of services-based model. And the other one is a pure tech play, which is the AI-driven workforce intelligence platform. So I can explain why there's two models, and it goes to the interesting story of raising so far. It's really difficult in climate to come up with a pure tech play that fits the bill of your standard VC backable SaaS sort of model. I think some of those wins have already happened, and one of the difficulties with climate is you're solving both a sort of planet problem, an existential problem, and a commercial problem together. That can create quite confusing or complex ideas and complex models. You're also often not just solving a really simple pain point. It's not a better email. It is a better email that also saves trees and wildlife and helps companies decarbonize. So there's a bit more going on. Our model is really around, I guess we're an early stage startup, so it's a developing model. The services part with the training and the diagnostics is based around really solving an immediate need of companies and building relationships and feedback loops so that we understand better exactly the tiny pain points between each person in a workforce and the systems that are involved and the company, the executive decision-making, and sort of bring in data points from different, there's the learning experience, there's how it relates to their sort of L&D systems, as an example. Getting some of that early data and really making sure that we're on the right track in terms of building the workforce intelligence side of things. The workforce intelligence, that is an emerging field. It hasn't existed for very long. It's really based on machine learning, and that takes a bit of time to build and iterate, and especially with climate, we're not just looking at a standard model of a workforce and then kind of putting a few outputs that mention climate. It's really rethinking the whole structure of a business with climate skills in mind. So I mentioned before, climate and sustainability skills, green skills, no one's really defined what they are. One of the things we're doing is defining what a lot of those are into a model, which is quite complex. But yeah, so the first part is really around validating, building customer relationships, getting access and building some of the proprietary data models. And then the tech play is really where we scale what we're doing so that it can apply across organizations and in a much more sort of insightful and large scale way, I guess.
Yeah, I
Does
think
that
it's
kind of
interesting.
answer the question?
Yeah, it does. It does. So a service plus tech play, but obviously there's a level of needing the services business to try to help get and collect the data, because I'm very, very new to how AI and everything works. But my understanding is that it's very important to have a certain specific type of I don't know if the word is moat or data set that's kind of yours only, right? And things that
Yeah.
you have. So I think it's interesting to see, and I could see some pretty interesting outcomes potentially from the tech side of things for the future. But I guess to kind of try to wind things down here, what are, if you look forward into, let's just say 2-3 years, like based on what you're seeing right now, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges in the climate tech talent space being?
Yeah, I think there's two trends that are really important. So the first one is fairly obvious, and that is a real shortage of talent, because you have essentially every industry, every business in every industry, in every part of the world, trying to accelerate their transition to net zero at the same time. And we've historically massively underinvested in sustainability training, whether that's through university, whether that's through schools. And there is such a large transformation that needs to take place that there's not going to be enough talent available. That's part of why we're looking internally at the workforce, because we don't think companies will be able to get enough talent externally. The other one is really a move to specialization. I think currently anyone with a bit of sustainability, ESG, CSR, whatever, experience or knowledge kind of fits in one bucket. As we become much more specialized, I think you're going to get the data analytics people, the product design people, the supply chain specialists, and that will really kind of fragment the talent market. It's good because anyone who's got a specialization in that specific niche at the moment won't have to do too much to become a leading sort of figure in that field. If they put in the work over the next couple of years, they can almost come out as one of the leaders. And for anyone thinking about this, I think that's a really valuable place to start. Like, what experience do you have now, and how can I leverage that over the next few years with training or work experience or whatever? Publish your own blog.
Yeah, I mean, just to interject, I think about it from this perspective. If you're somebody who studied sustainability your whole life, or has worked in sustainability your life, you don't know necessarily. Yeah, maybe you've had exposure to the ins and outs of supply chain, for example. But if you've been in supply chain and then can apply the ESG lens or the sustainability lens, that can be very, very powerful, because you actually have all that experience, right? Some of the coolest companies I've had on this show, in my opinion, have been where people have been in an industry, traditional industry, forever, and they said, you know what? Why do we do it this way? Let's change it. And then they change it with a sustainability lens, and it's just awesome.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think we're going to see such a transformation of how businesses do things that, anyone that can bring the commercial, the technical, and the sustainability lens together will just be, super in demand and super valuable.
Mm-hmm. What is this is my last big question for you. What is something that to you see it coming, and you think it's pretty obvious to you, but maybe not to everybody else, that maybe 2 years from now we all look back and say, wow, that was obvious, but you believe this is coming, and you can see it already?
Yeah, really good question. I think it's the upheaval to companies, and I've banged on a little bit about this already. So maybe I don't need to go into too much detail, but if you think back to the adoption of information technology into companies during the sort of late 80s, 1990s, early 2000s, there was incredible upheaval, like tens of thousands of jobs being cut at corporations in America, hundreds of millions of dollars being spent. I think it was Motorola or something, $140 million a year on workforce training, set up their own university. That's kind of all fallen away over the years, and we've all gotten used to working with technology. But the transition to net zero is very much a similar sort of story, and companies really are going to have to reimagine their whole business model. As an example, and I'm not saying this is a great, one's better than the other, but you buy a shoe at the moment, like a Nike sneaker, and you wear it for 6 months and you throw it in the bin. In future, that's not going to work. And I've seen other companies try like a subscription model. You use it up, you return it to the company, you get a new one. So that's an example of a business model sort of being completely overturned. And I think we'll see a lot more of that across every industry and within every company. And I don't think people are ready for that.
I do think this is interesting. I've been banging on about this to my clients within the training side, because obviously we can help, make placements at a senior level, but when it comes down to more junior things, it doesn't make sense to pay a recruiter to do these things. But you need to have a method for training these people. It is really interesting because if you said this earlier, which was that everybody's going to be going to a sustainable kind of thing. And if every company is going to become a sustainable company, regardless of what they do, they're going to have to kind of think about sustainability. That also by nature means that you also need every single person in the workforce to be sustainably minded. Right. So that is interesting that, you can't just, that's not just a couple of seminars internally and everybody's good to go. But all right. Very, very good. Yeah. Any final thoughts or places people can reach you? This has been really great.
Yeah, this has been a great discussion. Well, you can email me at joe@azollo.com. It's AZOLLO. Always available. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn too, so reach out, Joe Bushnell. Last thing I mentioned, I've talked a bit about this, but I think anyone who is really excited to work in this space and develop their skills and has some sort of general experience, but wants to know how they can sort of accelerate their career and build their brand. I've been working on synthesizing everything that I've learned over the years into a course that I'm running on Maven in March. And that's really around looking at how you rethink value in your organization, how you can build your personal climate brand, and really accelerate sort of your career if you want to work in this space. So I'd love to have more people on that course. So it's on Maven. It's called the Climate Capable Leadership Course. Very nice. Well, this has been a great conversation, Joe. I really appreciate you coming on. I love talking about talent and everything. So it's obviously what I do. So I appreciate it. Thanks so much. We'll have to have you on again in the future. Thanks, Alice. It's been great. All right, thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please do share it with somebody who might find it interesting. Give us a review. It really does help grow the show, in particular on Apple Podcasts. And then definitely consider reaching out to connect with Joe and check out his website, what they're doing. If this is your first time, please, of course, subscribe and tap the bell for notifications to follow along on our journey. Quick note on our next episode. Our next episode, we will be speaking about packaging with James Malley. If you think that sounds interesting, you're definitely, if you don't think that sounds interesting, you're definitely not a nerd enough. I really enjoyed this conversation a lot because in a past life, I had a hobby business selling mate tea. If anybody knows mate, hit me up. We can chat about it. It's kind of fun. And I got really into the packaging aspects of things because we were shipping products across the country. And on top of that, growing up, I spent a lot of time helping load and pack things with my dad when we would transport cabinets that had to be installed.
And just utilizing space, I guess you could say, kind of runs in my veins. So it was really cool to have a conversation where the focus is actually maximizing space to save the climate. Again, maybe sounds nerdy to you, but it's a really, really fun conversation, I thought, with James. So stay tuned for that episode coming up next. And thanks again for joining us on the Clean Techies podcast. We will see you next time.